Malin, I just can't do this anymore. I want to be with someone healthy, someone beautiful, like you used to be. But now, his voice cracked slightly at the end, but there was no sadness in it. No regret, only exhaustion, maybe even disgust. I felt my breath catch, my fingers gripping the thin hospital blanket as if it were the only thing anchoring me to reality. The IV in my arm pulsed cold, a silent reminder of my weakness, of the poison inside me, of the fact that I wasn't the same girl I once was, the girl he loved. What? The word barely escaped my lips, hoarse and fragile. What are you saying, Ren? He sighed, running a hand through his hair, the way he always did when he was frustrated. But he wasn't frustrated. He was done. That realization settled in my gut like a stone, cold and unmovable. I don't want to be with you anymore, Malin, he said, voice steady now, as if he had finally decided. As if this was just another errand he had to check off his list. I can't do this. You've changed. Changed. I let out a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, to make sense of the words hanging between us like a noose. Of course I've changed. I'm sick, Ren. My voice cracked, but I forced myself to keep looking at him, to search his face for something. Hesitation, guilt, love, anything. But there was nothing, just that detached look, like he was talking to a stranger. I know, he muttered, his gaze shifting away. That's the problem. The words knocked the air from my lungs. My hands clenched the sheets, knuckles white. The problem? I echoed. So me getting sick is an inconvenience to you now? He exhaled, shaking his head like I was being dramatic, like I was making this harder than it had to be. It's not just the illness, Malin. It's everything. You're different. You don't laugh the way you used to. You don't smile. It's like you're not even you anymore. I'll get better, I whispered, my voice trembling. I'll be beautiful again. I promise. Just, please don't leave me. For the first time, his expression softened, but not with love, with pity. I hated it. It's not just about looks, he said, but I could hear the lie in his voice. Liar, I spat, anger surging through me like a desperate flame in the dark. You said you loved me. You swore you'd be here no matter what. Through anything, remember? That's what you said. Something flickered in his eyes, but it was gone as fast as it came. He exhaled sharply. I was in love with the girl you used to be, not this. This, not me, not Malin. Just something else. Something broken. Something unworthy. I felt my body trembling. Whether from anger, fear, or sheer devastation, I didn't know. My chest ached, and I realized I wasn't breathing properly, the weight of his words suffocating me. So that's it? I get sick, and you just throw me away like I'm nothing? He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe? A shadow of the love that used to be there? But then he blinked, and it was gone. You're disgusting. The world stopped. The monitor beside me beeped steadily, indifferent to my breaking heart. The white walls of the hospital room blurred, like the edges of a dream slipping away, or maybe a nightmare settling in. No, I whispered, shaking my head violently, refusing to believe. No, you don't mean that. I do. His voice was sharp, final. I gasped, my body shaking from the force of my own sobs. You said you'd never leave me, I choked out. You swore it. We planned everything together, Ren. Stop, he cut me off. Just stop. His voice was tired, like I was exhausting him just by existing. I reached for him. Even as my body ached, even as my heart begged me to stop, I reached for him. But he took a step back, then another, and another. Don't contact me again, he said quietly. Just don't. The walls were closing in. My hands were shaking as I clutched at the blanket, my nails digging into the fabric as if it could somehow stop him from disappearing. Ren, I sobbed. Don't do this. Please. He didn't stop. I watched, frozen in place, as he turned his back on me, as he walked to the door, his silhouette outlined against the bright hospital corridor. Then he opened it. Then he left. The door clicked shut, and just like that, he was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. I tried to breathe, but the air felt thick, like drowning, like sinking into something I couldn't escape from. My vision blurred as tears spilled freely down my cheeks, soaking the thin hospital gown, staining the sheets with my grief. A broken, wrecked sound tore from my throat. I pressed my hands to my mouth, shoulders shaking violently, trying to contain the sobs threatening to consume me whole. I wanted to scream, to rip the IV from my arm, to run after him, to demand answers, demand that he take it back, demand that he still love me. But I couldn't. I could only curl into myself, sobbing into the hospital sheets as the last pieces of my heart shattered around me. I still remember the first time I met Ren. It was one of those days when the world felt too big, too bright, too overwhelming. I had spent the morning in a doctor's office, listening to the same tired words. Be careful. Don't push yourself. Your body needs rest. As if I didn't already know. As if my whole life hadn't been built around limitations. But that day, I didn't want to be careful. I didn't want to rest. I wanted to feel alive. That's how I ended up at the summer festival, weaving through the crowd beneath a sky painted with paper lanterns. The scent of grilled food filled the air, mixing with the distant echo of laughter and music. I had told myself I would only stay for a little while, just long enough to pretend that I was just another girl in the crowd, someone who didn't have to think about medications and doctor visits. But then I tripped. It happened so fast. One moment I was walking, and the next, my foot caught on something, and I went stumbling forward. I braced for impact, but it never came. Instead, strong hands caught me, steadying me before I could hit the ground. "Whoa, easy there," a voice said, deep and amused. "You okay?" I looked up and met the warmest brown eyes I had ever seen. He was smiling, not in a mocking way, but in a way that made it feel like this was just another fun twist in his day. His grip on my arms was firm but gentle, steadying me as if I were something precious but unbreakable. I felt my face heat up. I wasn't paying attention. He let out a short chuckle. I could tell. I should have just thanked him and moved on. But something about him, his ease, his warmth, kept me frozen in place. "Ren," he said, offering his hand. "And you are?" "Malin," I murmured, placing my palm in his. His skin was warm, and I felt a strange comfort in the simple act of holding his hand for just that second longer than necessary. "Nice to meet you, Malin." He cocked his head slightly. "You here alone?" I hesitated, then nodded. His brows lifted slightly. "That's bold. Most people come with friends or a date." I swallowed. "I just wanted to do something different today." Ren tilted his head, studying me. "Different, huh? Well, if you're looking for fun, you're in luck. Because I happen to be an expert at that." He grinned. "Let's make tonight unforgettable." That night, we wandered the festival together, hopping from game booth to game booth. Ren was terrible at the ring toss, but he refused to give up until he won me the biggest stuffed bear there. "You're not leaving without this," he said with determined confidence, throwing another ring with the precision of a man on a mission. I teased him for his terrible aim. He pretended to be offended. We talked, and I laughed more than I had in years. When the fireworks exploded across the sky, he pulled me to a grassy hill where the lights reflected in his eyes. I remember turning my head to look at him instead of the sky, feeling something shift inside me. Something fragile, something terrifying. I was falling for him. After that night, Ren became a constant in my life. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence, bumping into him at the cafe near my house, seeing him at the park where I like to read. But then he started waiting for me after my doctor's appointments, always with an easy smile and a casual, "Hey, thought you might need some company." I did. Ren made everything feel lighter. When I told him about my weak health, I expected him to pull away. Most people did. But he didn't. "Okay," he said simply. "So we'll take things slow when you need to. That doesn't mean you can't still live, Malin." And we did live. He took me to places I never thought I'd have the energy to go. Late-night drives where the world felt endless, quiet afternoons at the beach where he would write my name in the sand and take pictures before the waves could erase it. "You're stuck with me," he would joke. Sickness and health, all that stuff. Sometimes, when I was too sick to go out, he would just lie next to me, scrolling through his phone while I rested my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. It was enough. One night, as we lay on the hood of his car, staring at the stars, he asked, "If you could have anything, what would it be?" I hesitated, then whispered, "Time." Ren turned his head toward me. "Time?" "Yeah," I murmured. "More time to do everything, more time to be happy." He was quiet for a moment, then reached for my hand, lacing our fingers together. "Then we'll make the most of the time we have," he said softly. "I promise." I believed him. I believed him when he whispered, "I'll never leave you, no matter what." I believed him so much that I didn't even realize when things started to change, when the laughter became less frequent, when the warmth in his eyes started to fade. I didn't realize how fragile promises could be. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Love makes you blind, doesn't it? It makes you ignore the signs, overlook the little things, convince yourself that the person you love is just having a bad day, that they're tired, stressed, distracted. It makes you tell yourself that everything is fine, even when, deep down, you know it isn't. I had always known that I was difficult to love, not because I wanted to be, but because my body made it that way. There were days when I couldn't leave the house, when exhaustion clung to me like a heavy blanket, making even the smallest tasks feel impossible. Days when my hands shook too much to hold a coffee cup, when my chest ached from the effort of breathing. But Ren never made me feel like I was a burden. Until he did. At first it was subtle, so subtle that I barely noticed it. The way his texts became shorter, the way he started answering hours later, sometimes not at all, the way his voice sounded distant on the phone, as if he were somewhere far away even when he was right beside me. The way he used to look at me, with warmth, with devotion, with something close to awe. Slowly, that look began to fade. I told myself I was imagining it, that relationships changed, that maybe he was just tired, that maybe I was the problem, too sensitive, too afraid of losing the only person who had ever made me feel truly loved. So I ignored it, until I couldn't anymore. The first time I really felt it was the night I called him after my fever had spiked unexpectedly. I could barely hold the phone, my fingers weak and trembling as I pressed the call button. The world was spinning, my vision blurring at the edges, my skin clammy and burning all at once. "Ren," I whispered when he picked up, my voice raw. "I don't feel good." A long silence. Too long. Then he sighed. "Malin, it's late." I blinked, my throat tightening. "I know, I need you." Another pause, and then, finally, "Okay, I'll be there soon." He came. But something was different. Ren used to rush into my arms, holding me like I was something precious. That night, he sat on the edge of my bed, his hands in his lap, his eyes heavy with something unreadable. "Sorry," I murmured. "For what?" "For calling you so late." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, well, you always do." I froze. He must have realized how sharp his words sounded, because he quickly added, "I just mean, you get sick a lot." I nodded, curling my fingers into the blanket. "Yeah, I do." For the first time, it felt like a flaw. After that, things only got worse. Ren started canceling plans more often. "I have work," he would say. Or, "I already promised I'd go out with the guys." The first time, I told myself it was just one time. The second, I made excuses for him. By the fifth, I stopped keeping track. And it wasn't just that. It was the way he pulled his hand away just a second too soon when I reached for him. The way he started coming over less, texting less, calling less. The way his kisses became mechanical, empty, an obligation rather than something he wanted. I told myself relationships changed, that maybe it was just a rough patch, that maybe if I tried harder, loved him more, he would come back to me. So I did. I laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. I dressed up when we went out, even when my body ached from exhaustion. I stopped telling him when I felt sick, stopped calling him when I needed him. I wanted to be easy to love, but no matter how much I tried, it wasn't enough. The night I truly understood that something had changed, it rained. I had been feeling sick all day, head throbbing, body aching, exhaustion sinking into my bones. Ren was supposed to come over, but he hadn't texted me all afternoon. Hours passed. The rain poured harder. Finally, I called him. He answered on the fourth ring. "Malin, what is it?" His tone was irritated, like I had interrupted something important. I hesitated. I just wanted to see you." A long pause. "I'm busy." Something inside me twisted. "Ren, please, I don't feel good. Can you just—" "Malin." His voice was sharp. "I can't be there every time you don't feel good." The words hit me harder than I expected. My fingers clenched around the phone. I know, but what?" He let out a frustrated sigh. "You always need me. Every time something happens, you expect me to drop everything and come running. It's exhausting." I felt nausea rise in my throat. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Another pause. Then, softer, almost guilty. "I just need space, okay?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Okay," I murmured. But I already knew that space was just another word for distance, and distance was just another way of saying goodbye. After that night, Ren started disappearing. Some days, I barely heard from him at all. My texts would sit unread for hours, sometimes a whole day. When I confronted him, he sighed. "Malin, I'm just busy. You overthink things too much." Maybe I did. Or maybe I was finally seeing things clearly. The day I knew, really knew, was a week later. I was feeling stronger that day, so I surprised him at his apartment. I knocked, waiting for his familiar, tired grin, for him to pull me inside and wrap his arms around me like he used to. But when he opened the door, his face fell. "Malin, what are you doing here?" I hesitated. "I just wanted to see you." Another sigh. "You can't just show up unannounced." The words felt like ice in my veins. "I'm your girlfriend," I whispered. "Since when do I need permission to see you?" He rubbed his forehead. It's a bad time." I swallowed past the lump in my throat. "When is it ever a good time anymore, Ren?" He didn't answer. I should have walked away. I should have told him that if he needed space, I would give him all the space in the world. But instead, I reached for him. "Ren, please. I don't know what's happening between us, but—" He stepped back. Just a small step, barely noticeable. But it was enough. Enough to tell me everything. I nodded, forcing a small, broken smile. "I get it now." I turned before he could see my tears. Because I knew, deep down, I had already lost him. The silence in the hospital room was suffocating. I lay curled on my side, my body trembling, though not from sickness this time. My eyes burned, swollen from crying, my throat raw from the sobs I had desperately tried to suppress. The sheets beneath me were damp where my tears had soaked through, and no matter how many times I wiped my face, the tears just kept coming. I had nothing left. Ren was gone. The man who once held my hand and whispered promises of forever had walked away as if I meant nothing. As if I had been nothing more than a burden, something heavy he had finally chosen to drop. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the memory of his last words. "You're disgusting." A fresh wave of pain surged through me. Not the physical kind. I had learned how to live with that. This was something deeper, something raw, something that no medication could numb. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling the uneven rhythm of my heart, wondering if it was possible to actually die from this kind of hurt. It felt like it, like something inside me had been ripped open, leaving nothing but a hollow, aching void. The room felt too big, too empty, too cold. I wanted to disappear. A sharp knock at the door made me flinch. I sucked in a shaky breath, my body tensing. It was probably the nurse. She usually came around this time, checking in on me with forced cheerfulness, pretending not to notice the dark circles under my eyes, the way I barely touched my food anymore. I needed to pull myself together. Quickly, I wiped my face with the sleeve of my hospital gown, though I knew it wouldn't do much to hide the damage. My lips still trembled, my nose was red, and my voice, if I tried to speak, would be hoarse and weak. But I didn't want to hear another soft, "Are you okay?" from someone who didn't really care about the answer. The door creaked open. "Good evening, Malin," a familiar voice said. I looked up, expecting to see my usual nurse, but instead, my doctor, Dr. Lin, stepped into the room, and behind him stood someone I had never seen before. I stiffened slightly, instinctively pulling the blanket up higher over my chest, shielding myself from their gazes. Dr. Lin, in his usual calm, professional manner, gave me a small nod before gesturing to the young man beside him. "This is Elias," he said. "He'll be your new attending nurse starting tomorrow. He'll be assisting with your care from now on." I blinked, my already exhausted brain struggling to process his words. New attending nurse? My usual nurse, Maria, had been with me since my first hospitalization. She knew my habits, my quirks, the way I liked my blankets tucked in a certain way, how I hated the taste of certain medications. She had been predictable, reliable. The idea of having someone new, someone else, intruding on what little routine I had left made something twist uncomfortably in my chest. I glanced at Elias, assessing him through swollen eyes. He looked young, too young. His short brown hair was slightly messy, like he had run his fingers through it one too many times. His uniform was crisp, his ID badge freshly pinned to his shirt, but there was an almost nervous energy about him. Great. I was getting a rookie. I forced myself to sit up slightly, even though every muscle in my body ached with the effort. "Why?" My voice came out cracked, barely above a whisper. Dr. Lin adjusted his glasses. "Maria has been reassigned to another ward. Elias will be taking over her responsibilities for your care." I swallowed down the immediate annoyance bubbling up inside me. "So you're telling me I have to start all over again with someone new?" Elias shifted slightly at my tone, and I caught the way his jaw tensed, as if he wasn't used to being spoken to like this. Good. I wasn't in the mood to be polite. Dr. Lin sighed. "I understand this isn't ideal, but Elias is more than capable. He's recently completed his training, and this will be part of his practical experience." Training. Practical experience. I resisted the urge to groan. So not only was I losing the one person who actually knew how to take care of me, but I was now an experiment for some newbie trying to learn the ropes? I looked at Elias again, trying to gauge if he was just as uncomfortable with this arrangement as I was. To my irritation, he didn't look away. Instead, he met my gaze head-on, his dark eyes unreadable. Something about that annoyed me even more. I turned back to Dr. Lin. "Is there any way to request someone else?" Elias made a small noise in his throat, but Dr. Lin didn't react. "Unfortunately, not at this time. The hospital is short-staffed, and Elias has already been assigned to your case. I know change can be difficult, but I'd appreciate your cooperation." I clenched my teeth. Cooperation. As if I had a choice. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to relax. What was the point in arguing? I was too exhausted, too drained to fight this. It wasn't like I had much control over anything in my life right now. "Fine," I muttered, my voice dull. "Whatever." Dr. Lin gave a small nod. "Elias will officially start tomorrow, but I wanted to introduce you beforehand. I know this is a difficult time for you, but please don't take it out on him." I barely reacted to the statement. Elias, however, spoke for the first time. "I can handle it," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Something about the confidence in his tone caught me off guard. I looked at him again, this time really looking. There was no pity in his face, no forced sympathy. He wasn't smiling like Maria used to, like he was trying to reassure me. He was just standing there, watching. For some reason, that irritated me even more. I turned away. "Can you both leave now?" Dr. Lin sighed, but he didn't argue. "We'll see you in the morning, Malin. Try to get some rest." I didn't answer. I heard the door close behind them, the soft click echoing in the too quiet room. I stared at the ceiling, my body still aching with grief, exhaustion, and something else I couldn't quite name. Elias, a new nurse, a stranger. I hated change. I hated feeling like my life was being rearranged without my permission. And right now, I hated the fact that this was the reality I was left with. Alone. Abandoned. And now, under the care of someone who had no idea what kind of mess I had become. The days blurred together. Morning, evening, night. They all felt the same inside the dull white walls of the hospital. Time lost meaning when every hour bled into the next, with nothing to break the monotony. I barely noticed how many days had passed since that night. Since he left, I woke up, took my medications, lay in bed, and stared at the ceiling. Sometimes I scrolled through my phone, but most of the time, I didn't have the energy. The nurses came and went, faceless figures in a routine that never changed. Meals arrived, though I barely ate. Tests were done, results came in, but none of it mattered. Nothing mattered anymore. My parents hadn't visited. But that wasn't surprising. They were overseas, too caught up in their lives to drop everything for me. They never really had time for me anyway. I had no siblings, no family close enough to care. Only two people still reached out to me, my best friends, Claire and Yuki. Every day, they sent me messages, silly memes, voice notes full of love and encouragement, updates about their lives, as if trying to keep me tethered to the world outside this sterile room. But they were miles away, across the country, unable to come. And texts, no matter how kind, couldn't replace the feeling of someone sitting beside you, holding your hand, reminding you that you weren't completely alone. And I was alone. At least, that's how it felt. Elias had been coming to check on me every day, just as Dr. Lin had said he would. At first, I barely noticed him. He came in, did his job, and left without unnecessary conversation. He was efficient, careful, and, most importantly, he never forced me to talk. And that was fine. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to pretend I was okay. But Elias was different. He never looked at me with pity. Never gave me the forced, overly cheerful smiles that so many nurses did, the kind meant to brighten my spirits. He simply did his work quietly, treating me with the same care and professionalism every time. And surprisingly, he was good at his job. Despite being new, he handled everything with a calmness that put me at ease. When he adjusted my IV, his hands were steady. When he changed the bandages on my arm, he was careful, methodical. For someone who was still in training, he never hesitated. I caught myself watching him sometimes, wondering how he stayed so composed. There was something almost soothing about him, the way he moved, the quiet confidence in his actions. But still, we barely spoke. Until the day he finally broke the silence. It happened in the late afternoon, when the sun was starting to cast golden streaks across the hospital walls. I was lying in bed, as usual, staring at the small stack of books on my bedside table. Elias was adjusting the monitor next to me when he suddenly spoke. "You like Dostoevsky?" His voice was deep but gentle, with a quiet curiosity that caught me off guard. I blinked, turning my head slightly. He was looking at the book on my table, Crime and Punishment. For a moment, I didn't answer. Then, hesitantly, I nodded. "Yeah." Elias reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against the book's worn cover. "That's heavy reading." I almost smiled. "I like heavy books." He seemed to think about that for a second, then nodded. "Yeah, me too." I studied him, curiosity stirring for the first time in days. "You've read it?" "Twice." He glanced at me as if gauging my reaction. "But I think I liked the Brothers Karamazov more." I raised an eyebrow. "You read the Brothers Karamazov?" A faint hint of amusement crossed his face. "What, I don't seem like the type?" I shrugged, surprised to find that I was enjoying this. Most people don't make it past Crime and Punishment. "Well," he said, tucking his hands into his pockets, "most people don't spend their teenage years debating morality and existential despair for fun." That time, I actually did smile. A small one, barely there, but real. Elias seemed to notice. His expression softened, though he didn't comment on it. Instead, he leaned slightly against the counter, tilting his head. "What's your favorite book?" I hesitated. No one had asked me that in a long time. No Longer Human by Osamu Dazai. He exhaled a quiet laugh. Wow, you do like heavy books. I told you. Elias nodded, considering something. That one's good, he admitted. Brutal, but good. I glanced at him. You've read it? He looked almost offended. Of course. Something warm flickered in my chest. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was the first time in weeks that I had felt anything other than numbness. I had always loved talking about books. Ren never really cared about them. Whenever I tried to talk to him about my favorite novels, he would nod, pretend to listen, but his attention was always elsewhere. It never really felt like he understood. But Elias understood, and I liked that. From that day on, things changed. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't like I suddenly stopped feeling empty or that the pain of Ren's betrayal disappeared. But something shifted. Elias and I started talking. It started small, brief conversations about literature, about different authors we liked. Then it became more. We talked about philosophy, about movies, about places we wanted to visit. Sometimes he would ask me small, seemingly random questions. If you could only read one book for the rest of your life, which would it be? What's the worst book you've ever read? Do you think tragic endings are better than happy ones? And each time, I found myself answering. I found myself wanting to answer. It felt nice. Talking to him didn't feel forced. It didn't feel like an obligation, like something I had to do to fill the silence. It felt natural. Elias never tried to cheer me up in the way people usually did. He never gave me empty reassurances, never told me things would get better, or that everything happens for a reason. Instead, he listened. He really listened. And he spoke to me like I was a person, not a patient, not someone fragile or pitiful, just a person. It had been so long since I had felt that way. And without even realizing it, I started looking forward to his visits. Each day, when the door opened and I saw him step inside, I felt something unfamiliar stir in my chest, something like relief, something like hope. The weeks passed in a slow, quiet rhythm. Each day felt a little less heavy, a little less suffocating. The pain of Ren's betrayal didn't disappear, but it dulled, like an old wound that still ached but no longer bled. I kept to my routine. Morning checkups, meals I barely touched, books I read to pass the time, and of course, Elias. His presence had become something steady, something familiar. Every day, he would come in, check my IV, adjust my blankets, and without fail, we would talk. About books, about stories, about the strange way life mirrored fiction. I found myself looking forward to those moments, but I didn't want to think about why. One afternoon, I decided to read one of my older books, a worn copy of The Picture of Dorian Gray. It had been sitting untouched for weeks, buried beneath other novels on my bedside table. I flipped through the pages, searching for where I had last left off. That's when I saw it, the bookmark. I froze, my fingers tightening around the book. It was simple, just a pressed white lily encased in glass, with a thin silver tassel at the end. But the moment I saw it, my chest clenched. Ren had given it to me. "So you don't dog-ear the pages anymore," he had teased, placing it in my hand months ago. He had always made fun of me for my habit of folding corners instead of using bookmarks. But even then, he had never cared about my books the way I did. He never asked about what I was reading, never listened when I tried to explain why a certain novel made me feel something. And yet, I had still loved him. I had still clung to him like he was the only person in the world who would ever care for me. My throat tightened. How foolish had I been? He had never really seen me. He had never been interested in my passions, my thoughts, my world. And in the end, the moment things became difficult, the moment I was no longer the version of myself that he wanted, he left. What kind of love was that? A broken kind, a selfish kind, not the kind that lasts. I swallowed hard and stared at the bookmark, my mind racing with memories. His voice laughing in the distance as I trailed behind him, struggling to keep up. "You always need me. You're exhausting. You're disgusting." I felt something sharp twist in my chest. Maybe he had never really loved me. Not truly. And if he hadn't, then what had I been holding on to? I took a shaky breath, my fingers trembling slightly as I reached up and pulled the bookmark from the pages. For a moment, I just stared at it, hesitating. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, I set the book aside and slid the bookmark into the drawer of my nightstand. Not thrown away, not destroyed, but put away, because I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need him anymore. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly, letting the weight of it all sink in. And then, without meaning to, another thought entered my mind. Books. And Elias. My eyes snapped open. Why was I thinking about him? I pressed my palms to my cheeks, feeling the warmth spreading across my skin. No. Stop that. But the thought had already taken root. Elias, with his quiet voice and steady presence. Elias, who actually listened when I talked about books. Elias, who never looked at me like I was fragile or broken or someone to be pitied. I had spent so long feeling unwanted, feeling like I was too much. But with him, it wasn't like that. I had never even considered thinking of him like that before. But now? I bit my lip, shaking my head quickly. It was ridiculous. I wasn't some lovesick girl in a romance novel, ready to fall into someone else's arms just because my heart was hurting. That wasn't what this was. But still, Elias had become a part of my days, whether I had meant for him to or not. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't want to run away from that. I didn't want to close myself off. I wanted to move forward, even if it was slow, even if I still wasn't sure where I was going. I pulled my blanket around me, pressing my fingers to my warm cheeks. Maybe, just maybe, life wasn't over yet. Going home felt strange. The air smelled different, fresher than the sterile hospital rooms I had grown used to. The walls of my apartment seemed unfamiliar at first, like I was stepping into someone else's life. Everything was just as I had left it, the books neatly arranged on my shelves, the cozy blankets draped over my couch, the soft glow of fairy lights in my bedroom, and yet it all felt distant. But I was free. No more waking up to the beeping of machines. No more strict routines. No more feeling trapped inside a place that had held me for too long. At first, the loneliness hit me hard. After weeks of constant care and the presence of people around me, the silence of my apartment was almost deafening. My parents sent a brief message, reminding me to take care of myself. Claire and Yuki called when they could, but they were still too far away to do more than send virtual hugs. And then, there was Elias. Every day, without fail, he messaged me. At first, it was simple. Hey, how are you feeling today? But soon, our conversations stretched into long, winding discussions about everything and nothing at the same time. We talked about books, of course, about which stories stayed with us, which ones disappointed us. He teased me about my love for tragic endings, and I teased him for his obsession with philosophy. But we also talked about small, everyday things. I sent him pictures of my meals when I actually had the appetite to cook. He sent me photos of his cat, a fluffy gray thing named Oatmeal, who apparently had a habit of sitting on his work notes whenever he tried to study. We even reminisced about the hospital, about our first conversation, about how grumpy I had been when we met. You were so irritated, Elias laughed over the phone one evening. I'm pretty sure you wanted to throw something at me. I still kind of do, I joked. Fair. But hey, you tolerated me long enough, so I must have done something right. I smiled, playing with the edge of my blanket. Yeah, I guess you did. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized something. I missed him. Not just our conversations, not just his voice through my phone speaker. I missed him. The way he always looked so calm, even when I knew he was nervous. The way his voice softened when he spoke to me. The way he listened, really listened. I hesitated for a long time before sending a text. Me, do you ever think about meeting up? The response came almost instantly. Elias, are you reading my mind? I blinked at my screen. Me, what do you mean? Elias, because I've been trying to figure out how to ask you the exact same thing. I laughed softly, warmth spreading through my chest. Me, so why didn't you? Elias, because I didn't know if you'd want to. I didn't want to push you. I hesitated for only a second before typing back. Me, I'd like to see you, Elias. The 3 little dots indicating his reply appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, Elias. Okay, but let me plan something. It'll be a surprise. A surprise. I bit my lip, curious and nervous all at once. Me. You know I don't like surprises, right? Elias. Trust me. You'll like this one. The evening of our meetup, I stood outside my apartment, trying to calm my nerves. I had never really thought about what Elias looked like outside of the hospital. He had always been in his uniform, always with a clipboard in hand, always professional. But when he arrived, I barely recognized him. He wore a dark blue sweater and a black coat, his usually neat hair slightly tousled. He looked softer somehow, younger, and in his hands, flowers, a small bouquet of light blue hydrangeas wrapped in simple white paper. I stared. You got me flowers? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Elias looked slightly embarrassed, rubbing the back of his neck. Is that weird? I wasn't sure if I should, but... I reached out, taking them gently. They smelled fresh, delicate, a scent that made my chest ache in a way I didn't quite understand. No, I said, my fingers tightening around the stems. It's not weird. His lips curled into a small smile. Good. The surprise? A secluded spot by a lake. The place was beautiful. Calm water reflecting the city lights in the distance, surrounded by trees that rustled gently in the evening breeze. A wooden dock stretched out over the water, and soft lanterns lined the path leading up to it. It was peaceful, romantic even. Elias had brought a blanket, which he spread out so we could sit comfortably. I couldn't stop glancing at him. He looked different in this setting, relaxed, yet nervous. Are you okay? I asked after a while, tilting my head. He let out a quiet breath. Yeah, He hesitated, then gave a small laugh. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and now that we're here, I'm kind of overthinking everything. I raised an eyebrow. Thinking about what? He looked at me then, really looked at me, his brown eyes deep and unreadable. Malin, he said softly, I like you. The words settled between us, quiet and warm. I felt my breath catch. Elias didn't look away. I don't want to rush anything. I don't want to pressure you. But I need you to know, I care about you, a lot. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Something in my chest squeezed, fear, sadness, relief, all tangled together. And then, before I could stop myself, I whispered, I need to tell you something. Elias frowned slightly, but nodded. Okay. I swallowed hard. Before I met you, I was in a relationship. He left me when I got sick, told me I was exhausting, told me I was disgusting. My voice wavered, but I forced myself to keep going. I thought he loved me, but the moment things got hard, he disappeared. Elias's expression darkened instantly. That bastard. I let out a short, humorless laugh. Yeah. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. If I ever meet him, I swear. I smiled, my eyes stinging. Elias! He looked at me, and for some reason, that was what broke me. Tears slipped down my cheeks. I quickly wiped them away, but Elias reached out, his fingers brushing my wrist gently. Hey, he murmured. You don't have to be strong all the time. I let out a shaky breath, and in that moment, I knew. I wasn't alone. Maybe it would take time. Maybe my heart wasn't ready for something new yet. But as Elias sat beside me, his presence warm and steady, I realized I wasn't afraid to try. I never thought love could feel like this. Not rushed, not desperate, not something I had to chase, afraid it would slip through my fingers the moment I let my guard down. With Elias, love was patient, steady. It was there in the quiet moments, in the way he listened, in the way he never tried to fix me, but instead stood beside me as I found my own way forward. After that night by the lake, things between us changed, but not in a way that scared me. Elias didn't push. He didn't expect anything more than what I was ready to give. We continued talking every day, but now there was something new between us. A warmth, a quiet understanding, an unspoken promise that we had time. And for the first time, I truly believed that was enough. Our first official date came a few weeks later. Elias insisted on keeping it simple. Dinner at a small, cozy restaurant, followed by a bookstore visit. I figured you'd be more impressed with shelves of books than with expensive food, he had joked, and I had laughed because he was right. We spent hours there, wandering through aisles, pointing out titles we had loved and ones we wanted to read. He watched me as I ran my fingers along the spines of old classics, his eyes warm and full of something I still wasn't ready to name. That night, as he walked me home, he hesitated at my door, rubbing the back of his neck the way he always did when he was nervous. "I had a really good time," he said. I smiled, my fingers playing with the edge of my sleeve. "Me too." He exhaled slowly. "Can I—" He hesitated, then chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Never mind. Too soon." I tilted my head. "What?" Elias looked at me, his lips twitching into a small smile. "I was going to ask if I could kiss you, but I meant what I said before. I don't want to rush you." I stared at him, warmth creeping up my neck. He was waiting. Always waiting. And for the first time, I realized I didn't want him to wait. So, instead of answering, I took a step forward, placed my hands gently against his chest, and leaned in. The moment our lips touched, I felt it. Not fireworks, not an explosion of emotions, but something deeper, something real. He kissed me softly, carefully, like I was something precious, like he had been holding back for so long that he didn't know how to let go all at once. When we finally pulled apart, he exhaled a quiet laugh, pressing his forehead against mine. "Okay," he murmured. "That was worth the wait." I smiled, my heart full in a way it had never been before. Looking back, it's funny how much my life has changed. There was a time when I thought love meant holding on so tightly that it hurt, that if I just tried harder, if I just gave more, I would be enough for someone to stay. But love isn't supposed to feel like that. Love isn't something you beg for. It's something that finds you when you're not searching. Something that stays, not because it has to, but because it wants to. Elias never made me feel like I had to prove my worth. He never asked me to be anything other than who I was. And, for the first time in my life, I understood that love isn't about who stays when things are perfect. It's about who stays when everything falls apart. And this time, I wasn't afraid. The seasons changed. I recovered, slowly but surely regaining my strength. There were still difficult days, but they didn't feel so lonely anymore. Elias was always there. Some nights, we sat by the lake where he had first confessed to me, watching the water ripple under the soft glow of lanterns. Other nights, we stayed in, curled up on my couch with books in our hands, our fingers occasionally brushing as we turned the pages. He had become a part of my world in a way I never expected, in a way that was so effortless, so natural. It was hard to remember a time without him. And one day, months after we had first met, I asked him something that had been lingering in my mind for a while. "Do you regret it?" He looked up from his book, confused. "Regret what?" "That you were assigned to me," I said softly. "That you had to deal with me during your first real job." Elias blinked, as if the thought had never even crossed his mind. Then he reached out, taking my hand in his, lacing our fingers together. "I didn't have to be there, Malin," he murmured. "I wanted to be." And in that moment, I knew. I had finally found the love I deserved.